I'm going to speak a little about people whom we call Naskapis today. They weren't always, well, some of them were Naskapis, but it's also a mix of Innu and certainly Cree or EU would be the name today. I haven't had a chance to mention that the Crees call themselves Cree in English, but if they're speaking certainly in their language, they're the EU of East She, which of course refers to James Bay. But to get back to the Naskapis, I became interested in them because as I was reading the Hudson's Bay Company records, especially for the northern posts like Fort George or Great Whale River, I discovered that they referred to some Indians, as they were called. They were certainly weren't called Cree in those days. Some Indians who were coming from the north, but they only come ever so often because they're out busy hunting caribou. So I decided to concentrate on just these people in the north. As I say, today we know of them as the Naskapi. They were the Indians who were hunting the barren ground caribou that stretched through the north on the tundra, and their economy was different from the Crees to the south, who had a much more mixed economy, where they hunted caribou when they could find them. There were the woodland caribou, and so they were much smaller herds of perhaps 10 or a dozen, whereas the barren ground could be in herds of, I'm getting out of my area of comfort about talking about caribou herds, but they could be certainly in the hundreds, if not the thousands at the time, that were on a migration route. The Naskapis usually knew where to be able to find them. In the years that they couldn't find them, of course, they suffered terribly. So I was looking at the difference in social organization, what the difference is if you're living off beaver in a mixed economy, or if you're living off principally caribou. And I discovered by going back through the Hudson's Bay records and also looking at some of the early explorers who were moving eastwards into the Ungava region, that they would come across groups of, again, call them Naskapis, who were living in groups of 200. They had killed enough caribou during the fall migration season that they could live together in very large numbers. Now, this contrasts dramatically with the Crees to the south, who would be in the wintertime living in winter hunting groups of maybe 25 or 30. So you could see the difference in terms of their subsistence, that the Naskapis were able to have a much larger social organization. But of course, once the winter ended and the caribou ended, they had to the caribou meat ended. They had to go find another means, and they would go fishing or look for small game. And they did break up into smaller hunting groups. But they also, as I've mentioned, were the people who were not that interested in the fur trade. They were all very much wedded and appreciated or enjoyed the hunt, the chase of the caribou, and so they stayed away from beaver trapping unless they needed some items. And so then some winters when the caribou were not plentiful, they would move south into grounds and do some trapping. But they always said the reason that they were not interested in becoming beaver trappers was they said they could get all they needed from the caribou. It provided them with food, it provided them with clothing, it provided them with tenting material, it provided them with tools, the antlers being used certainly as many different types of tools. So I realized also this confirmed for me the family hunting territories, because where they're mentioned in the trading post journals to the south, where it's mentioned he's going back to his hunting ground, and indications of the family hunting territories, you really didn't see any of this kind of language applied to the Naskapis. This is why I was interested in looking them, and I did some publishing on them. I am now working on a history of the Ungava region, and I have much more to say about the Naskapis because they were coming in to trade principally at the post at Fort Chimo. Now, I did before I began teaching at McGill, I did research for the Crees in areas that they asked, always in history, or they wouldn't have be asking me to do the research if it weren't history. I guess I had the luxury, as I was the only one at the time who was looking through the Hudson's Bay Company records, so I kind of had a monopoly on the field. I presume that there are others who are now using these records as well. So I worked for the Cree Regional Authority when they wanted histories done of certain areas, and for instance, I researched It was a very fast research. I researched people who today make up the community of Ujibwe. The government was saying, oh no, they're not a separate band. It took about 2 days to go through the Mistassini records and discovered that in fact they were constantly the Ujibwe people were constantly being referred to as a separate band. So I did research like that. I also did curriculum development projects at Wiscagonish. There was a very active group of teachers, Crees, like Gertie Diamond's sister, Annie Whiskey-chan, and Gertie Diamond's husband, John Murdoch, who were very involved in changing the kind of teaching that was going on in the Crees schools. And they began a curriculum development program called Creeway. And I participated in that in providing some of the historic materials. And I was also able to provide some funding to help them collect some of the oral traditions. So it's in different ways like that I was available and working on research projects that were asked for. I remember being asked to do a kind of northern history, referring to the history around Fort George, today Chisasibi, and I certainly did this. All of these histories just became in research material that I was able to use in a later book when I did the history from 1870 on. And of course, when I was doing research for that, I was able to do feedback for these to these other reports and add to them. Let me talk about oral tradition, because I haven't talked about it much, and it's kind of a little shameful because, of course, it's the history that the Crees know, and it's the history that formed their outlook on the world. I would love to be able to incorporate more. I was delighted when I learned way back in the 70s when I was working, as I said, on my research. Richard Preston was a great influence on me on his writings, because I learned from him one of many things, but I learned that the Cree have two genres of history. One are the Tabajaman stories that are eyewitness, and the other are the Ajikan stories, which are stories of long ago, and they would fit more into our mold genre of myth. And so I thought, okay, I've got these Tabajaman stories, they're eyewitness, they're pretty detailed. I'll just go ahead and use those. I'll incorporate them, because I, believe me, did not really understand the myths. Again, I feel that unless you're really a Cree speaker, you're not going to have a full understanding of what those idioms are saying to you. So I would just take details from from the oral tradition, and I would pluck them into my Western-driven history. I called it as somebody in England had written, they talked about it as plucking currants from a cake. So I made this a little more Canadian. I think I may have said plucking raisins from the cake and just plucking them in. But I realized too, I remember writing an article in 1984 saying this is what I can do with the oral history. I can use their details. But as I thought about it more and more, I realized that just plucking those currants and those raisins was losing the coherence of the story. And many of the stories, even though they were eyewitness stories, were still calling on a spiritual order that I knew nothing about and that I didn't understand. I published that paper called Plunder or Harmony, where I was starting to question how faithful I was to the oral tradition of the Crees by just using it the way I was using it. So this article was published in a collection entitled Decentering the Renaissance. It was edited by Germaine Workington and Carolyn Podruchny, who I'm proud to say was a student of mine as an undergraduate, and she went on to do her PhD and is teaching at York. And I was surprised by this essay because I was a little timid about introducing the concept, and it was picked up in another collection of essays several years later. So somebody thought it had some merit, and I think it was just a good debating point for people to start thinking about the oral tradition and whether or not we can just exploit it, just plunder, as I say, is the best word I can think of using. So I'm sure I angered some because so many people use the oral tradition and aren't so concerned about the fact that they don't speak the language. And I think it made them a little uneasy about it. But I think even today, since 2000, so 10 years later, I think I'm still sticking to those beliefs. So. I also did some research in the years in the 1980s for some of the law firms, and one of them very active with the Cree here was Hutchins, Soroka and Dion, and they had done a lot of work for them. But they also were involved in the Temagami case as to whether or not people signed Treaty 9 in Ontario. And so I was providing some historical background, but I got a lot more out of it because I sat in on their brainstorming sessions, trying to see what kind of case they were going to be presenting before the court. So to me, that was pretty exciting to be able to see how lawyers work, and it really does require brainstorming, and we all put our heads together, and I think we made a pretty good case. I've forgotten what the outcome of it was. I just don't remember. There was also a case with Gowlings and Lafleur on the forestry in Waswanipi in terms of what rights the Cree had to that land. So again, I was asked to prepare historic material. That case never came to court because the new relationship agreement was signed in 2002, what came to be known as the Le Pays de Brave. And so that case is just in abeyance. If the government doesn't fulfill its obligations under the agreement, then the Crees can open that case again. I must say I never did appear in court. I was never called as an expert. All these cases seem to be settled without being there. And I'm very glad, because people who were in court and were cross-examined found it very, very difficult. It was just you could never stick with the evidence that you had. It was always being contorted in some other way by the lawyer. So I missed that. I also gave up the opportunity to do a tobacco smuggling case because and on the side of it was a Huron case actually. And on the side of the Huron, because I just didn't think that tobacco should be that widespread. So I passed up that opportunity. And then I have been asked by Hydro-Quebec, although it was the Crees who asked them, when they were working on the Rupert House diversion and the new power plant at East Main, I think it's the Cree just smartly wanting to get research done and saying to Hydro-Quebec, look, we wanted some idea of what kinds of changes have happened in Cree society since the signing of the James Bay Agreement. And so I was put to work on pulling out a kind of a report on the values and perceptions, particularly of the youth, also of the women, and the changes to these. And what I learned from it really was that the youth want to live in both worlds. They don't want to give up on their traditions, but they also want to avail themselves of modern living and have modern style occupations if they can. That isn't research that I did myself. I was using a report that was done by Stan Lutet from Moose Factory, and that was his master's thesis. And he had gone to East Main, which was his mother's home community, and he had done the research there. So I was very happy to have it and to summarize it for Hydro-Quebec, and also help develop my thoughts about it. Now we come to genealogies, and very informally, early on, when I could, providing information about families. I was able to use the digitized version of my Hudson's Bay Company records, and using a search mechanism, pull out some names and show several generations of it. And also, as I had mentioned, when Reverend Barnley gave family names to people, I was able then to trace back in some cases to the late 1700s. I'm not called upon to do this anymore because every Cree community has a cultural center or institute. Some of them are more active than others, but they all have in their cultural communities, in their centers, they all have church records now, which I didn't have on hand. They have a copy of those digitized Hudson's Bay journals that I had produced and David Denton had turned into digitized form for them. They have other materials that they can use, so they're doing their own genealogies. But well before that, back in the 1980s, I remember one night receiving a phone call from Moose Factory from a young Cree man, and he was asking me about his family background and everything, and we were talking. I was able to give him some information. And then just as we were ending the conversation, it just popped into my head because I remembered something. And I said, "How are you feeling?" And he said, "I'm okay." And we hung up. And 5 minutes later, he calls back and he says, "Why did you ask that?" And I said, "Oh, you know what? I had remembered that your family had suffered through a degenerating disease, unknown what it was, but that it was in several generations. So I was just checking to see if you were okay. So obviously missed you. But also I did work with a number of doctors starting in about the 80s because they were seeing, up in Chisasibi, they were seeing I'm not sure what to call it. I probably shouldn't call it anything. I think it was more of a mental deficiency issue. But at any rate, they were asking me to go back into the records, which I did, to find out what ancestors may have been sick. Because certainly those are the kinds of little details that would creep into the records. If you had a chatty trader, he might start telling you things about just what was happening, what was going on around him, or people coming in. And so if you read every word and you index it, you are able to pull out information like this. So I was happy to be able to help the medical people, and I was hoping that someday somebody might sit down and go through my records and come up with a kind of medical profile of what was happening to people. And this is before the old world diseases really hit the Crees. We're talking about ailments that seemed to hit them before they were struck with not smallpox, that's ancient, I'm sorry, but measles epidemics, influenza epidemics, and of course tuberculosis. And then again in my research, I know a lot about the Crees' approach to two animals that they favored most, and that's the caribou and the beaver. The caribou, as I've mentioned, provided much more meat than the beaver did. And the Hudson's Bay Company traders are complaining in their journals time after time about how if they've heard of a small herd of caribou, they're going after the caribou. They don't care about the beaver. And so as I become older in life and wiser, I'm starting to think, well, I think maybe it wasn't only the chase for the caribou or the hunt, because oftentimes they'd come back without any caribou, right? So it wasn't guaranteed that they were going to be able to feed their families. But I started thinking that maybe the men were happy to get away from the women and children and go off on hunting. And I tend to liken it to young fathers today who happen to run off to do other things as a kind of, there's also the camaraderie of the males. And I think there's something in there, but I haven't explored. I leave it for others to do. But the caribou was the favored food. And as I said, everything else was dropped when they had the opportunity to hunt caribou. And bringing the meat back to the camp was so important. And there were rituals that the Crees had to follow. If they had killed more than a few caribou, then the camp would move closer to the site of the killing of the caribou, and they would do the butchering there and the preparation of it. So then there was the beaver, and the beaver was we know from the archaeological record, I don't have to say supposed, the archaeological record shows that the Crees tended to be involved in a mixed subsistence, and they were taking small animals. If they could get caribou, they would, but they were really reliant on an animal like the beaver, which was about the next size in terms of providing meat to it. And of course, it was much easier to hunt the beaver because you knew where they were. Having family hunting territories really helped you, especially in the winter. You couldn't just walk into a territory that was totally covered in white and be able to identify where the lodges were. But going back and forth to the same territory every year enabled them to be able to predict this. And the beaver, too, was useful. Besides providing meat, it provided the skins, the robes that they were using. With the arrival of the Hudson's Bay Company as a kind of stable fur trade enterprise in James Bay, began really in the early 1700s, although the HBC first visited in 1668. It took on a commercial value. But I think there's no doubt that the beaver was important before that. And you have a Jesuit saying that in the early 1600s, he says the beaver does everything. The title of a book from the fur trade that Bruce Trigger, myself, and Louise Deschênes edited. I'm looking. I don't have it here. That it called "Le Castor Fêtu." That was our title because a Jesuit made reference to the fact that the beaver provides everything, including the important chisels, the twine, the tobacco, the tea that the Cree wanted. Eventually, the muskets, and I've written articles showing that the purchase of muskets in the early years was not very substantial. The Crees, probably because the muskets weren't very reliable. You can imagine that in minus 40-degree weather, they probably don't work very well. If the powder gets wet, then that's not very serviceable. If they run out of I've forgotten, the shot, then they're really in trouble. So the muskets, it took a while before the guns became important. And unfortunately, that's the Canadian lore, that the Indians traded muskets, this was the most important trade item. But it certainly wasn't for all those reasons. And also we have evidence from the Hudson's Bay records that that was one of the least important items that they traded. Also, they didn't need very many. If you had a hunting group and you had one or two amongst a group of 30 people, that's men, women, and children, that would be sufficient. So the question of the family hunting territories that I've referred to several times is an important one in terms of the debate that I mentioned that had occurred starting with Speck. But let me talk a little bit about what these family hunting territories were. They consisted in the Cree domain from definitely the pre-contact period, because we have the archaeological record. They looked like they were wintering in groups of 3 to 4 co-residential groups. And a co-residential group is really a nuclear family with a few other relatives attached, like a grandmother or a unwedded sister or a widow, or various others that become attached. So it's really a nuclear family, or what we would call also an extended family. And they tended to return every fall to pretty well the same territory to trap the beaver. These family hunting territories were not cast in stone. They didn't survey them. They only vaguely said, well, it's over, the limit of this is probably over by such and such a stream, and didn't have to go through this all the years because they were inherited. So a father would pass it on to his sons. So everybody just knew where the family of Namagoose hunts, for instance, or traps. You didn't have to sit down and have a mapping. You didn't have to have a great discussion about it. But also there was a flexibility to these hunting territories that you don't find in the literature written by Eleanor Leacock and some of the others who supported her primitive communism. But the flexibility certainly came, for instance, if there was a death in the one winter, one of the Cree died on that land, then people were worried about going back to the land the following year because they were worried that this would cause the death of animals. So they would end up probably dividing into separate extended families and joining other groups. And there was always a shifting of people in these groups. They were never particularly stable. They were flexible, as only one can be if you're out hunting and foraging and you can't guarantee the food supply. They also had sections to their family hunting territories because they knew that they had to leave some lodges with just a breeding couple. They couldn't just kill all animals in the lodge, or they wouldn't have beaver in coming years. So they did practice conservation, and they divided their land, as a lot of the traders mentioned, into sections. And some years they would hunt some sections and leave others, as one person said, much like a farmer leaves his land to lie fallow, they leave their hunting lands. So the person who was the head of this hunting territory was usually the eldest, but not necessarily. It depended on whether he was a capable hunter, was competent enough, and also was recognized as having spiritual powers that would enable the animals to come to him, to come to this group and make themselves available for hunting. So it was a combination, but it would generally to be found in the eldest male. I have not really published this, but I did find that there was one well-known hunter at Waskaganish who was deemed for his great spiritual powers in hunting. Years later, I discovered through government record, because he was such a good hunter, he could provide for his family. Years later, I did discover in the government records that on his hunting territories there happened to be a herd of woodland caribou. So he always had access to this woodland caribou, pretty well knew where they were. But the Crees were, of course, convinced, as well they should have been, that it was the spiritual powers that he had that enabled this hunter to do so well and lead a large family. I guess I should mention also that 30 years ago, Charles Bishop and I held a panel at the Canadian Anthropology meetings at CASCA on the hunting territories, because we wanted to try to set the record straight, given what Eleanor Leacock and others were saying about it. We published the results in Anthropologica. And now in a couple of weeks from now, thanks to Melanie Chaplier, a student from Belgium who's finished a stunning thesis on Nemaska hunting territories, she's reconvening a panel to discuss hunting territories and our state of knowledge about them 30 years later, and intends to put out another issue of Anthropologica to discuss the papers, to publish the papers of everybody's new thoughts and new inquiries into hunting territories.